She lost her husband, lost her home, lost her job. Her husband died, and left behind a mountain of debt owed to people you should never owe. They hunted her across the city like vultures circling a carcass. And today, Winter Hartley stood in the prestigious Blackwood Ranch, her fingers white-knuckled around the reins of a black horse, the last thing her father ever gave her, ready to trade it for a few more months of survival. 500,000. The whispers died. The entire room seemed to lose its air. Winter thought she misheard. The horse was worth 150,000 at most. Who would be insane enough to pay triple? She slowly turned around, and that was the moment she saw him for the first time. Tall, cold, danger radiating from every line of his body. A faint scar traced from his temple down to his left cheekbone. Eyes as deep blue as the ocean floor, staring straight through her as if she were the only thing worth looking at in this room full of billionaires. Winter had no idea who he was, but Preston Shaw, the man who had just humiliated her in front of everyone, the most ruthless debt collector in the city, suddenly went pale and took a step back. Anyone who made Preston Shaw afraid was definitely not a good person. Yet that man was walking straight toward her, and his eyes never once glanced at the horse. If you want to know what this mysterious man truly wants from Winter, hit that like button to support us. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next dramatic chapters. The man stopped less than a step away from Winter. She could catch the faint scent of sandalwood rising from his flawless black suit. She could see every silver thread in the wolf-engraved ring on his ring finger. But what held her gaze captive were those deep blue eyes, cold as a frozen lake in the heart of winter, fixed on her as though he were reading every page of her soul. He opened his mouth, his voice low and even, like pebbles rolling along the bed of a stream. Sterling Vance. Just 2 words. Nothing more was needed. Winter felt the blood in her body turn to ice. She had heard that name before. Who in Crescent Bay hadn't? Sterling Vance, the boss of the Vance Empire, the man who held half the city's underworld in his hands. People said he controlled everything from the finest casinos to the most luxurious nightclubs, that he could make a person disappear with nothing more than a nod, that even the police had to think twice before touching one of his men. And now that man was standing in front of her, having just paid $500,000 for her horse. Winter stepped back on instinct, her back brushing against Midnight's warm body. The horse snorted softly, as if trying to reassure her. She tightened her grip on the reins, struggling to keep her voice from shaking. "What do you want from me?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Sterling tilted his head slightly to one side, as though weighing whether she deserved an answer. Then he spoke, still in that calm, emotionless voice. "I don't need the horse." Winter blinked. She thought she had misheard for the second time that day. "Don't need the horse. Then why did you pay $500,000 for it?" Sterling didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough for Winter to feel as though she were being stripped bare beneath that gaze. Then he said, "I have an offer for you. You keep the horse. I erase the debt your husband left with my empire. In return, you work for me for 1 year. Accounting. You used to work in financial accounting before everything happened, didn't you?" Winter stood frozen. He knew about her old job, knew about the debt. He had investigated her. The thought filled her with anger and fear all at once. But somewhere between those two feelings, a small thread of hope was trying to slip through, and she hated herself for that. "There's no such thing as a free lunch," she said, her voice turning harder. "What do you really want?" One of Sterling's brows lifted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to ask so directly. Then he gave a faint nod, seeming to appreciate her bluntness. "You owe Preston Shaw." He tipped his chin toward the corner of the room, where Preston stood with a pale face and eyes burning with hatred. "He's my enemy. You work for me, and he can't touch you. It's that simple. So I'm just a pawn in the game between you and him. You can think of it that way," Sterling shrugged. "Or you can think of it as the only chance you have to get away from Preston without paying with something worse than money. The choice is yours." Winter fell silent. She glanced toward Preston and saw him gritting his teeth, staring this way but not daring to step forward. She remembered the things he had said to her earlier, the humiliations he had thrown at her in front of the crowd, the ugly hints about the price she would have to pay if she didn't have the money. Then she looked back at Sterling. This man was dangerous, she knew that much, but at least he was offering her a choice, not giving her an order. "Why?" she asked. her voice quieter now. Why me? Sterling was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was still cold, but there was something else in it, something Winter couldn't name. I don't do charity, Miss Hartley. I invest, and I see value in you. Winter let out a dry laugh, though nothing about this felt amusing. What value? I have nothing left. You have something money can't buy. Sterling stepped one pace closer, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear. You have backbone. I saw you refuse charity money from a stranger on the street a few months ago. You said you needed work, not pity. I remembered that. Winter felt her breath catch in her throat. He had seen her then, had watched her, and had remembered. She didn't know whether she should feel comforted or frightened. Maybe both. From the corner of the room, Mrs. Bellamy, the housekeeper of Blackwood Stables, was watching them with wide eyes. She had worked there for 20 years, had seen Sterling Vance come to buy horses many times before, but she had never seen him speak to anyone for this long, had never seen him explain anything to anyone. There was something different here, she thought, something that even Sterling Vance himself didn't realize. Sterling pulled a black business card with silver lettering from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to Winter. You have 24 hours, he said. After that, the offer expires. Then he turned and walked away without waiting for her answer. His steps were steady and measured, as if he already knew what her answer would be, or as if her answer didn't matter as much as the fact that he had given her a choice. Winter stood there, the card in her hand, watching his tall figure disappear beyond the door. Around her, whispers began to rise like waves breaking against the shore. People were talking about what had just happened, about Sterling Vance, about her, about $500,000. But Winter heard none of it. She only looked down at the business card in her hand. Sterling Vance, a phone number. No title, no address, just a name and a number, as though he didn't need to explain who he was, as though the whole world already knew. 24 hours. She had 24 hours to decide whether she would step into the world of the man the entire city feared. The small attic apartment lay in darkness when Winter pushed the door open and stepped inside. She tried not to make a sound, tiptoeing through the cramped living room where the worn-out sofa also served as her bed every night. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening she saw Rosie curled beneath a thin blanket, her soft brown curls spread across the pillow, her angelic face peaceful in sleep. Winter stood there for a long moment, looking at her daughter, feeling her heart soften and ache at the same time. The child was only 5 years old. She shouldn't have had to live in a damp apartment with cracked walls and the sound of mice scurrying inside them every night. She deserved more than this. Winter gently closed Rosie's door and walked to the small window overlooking the city. Crescent Bay at night glittered like a blanket sewn with diamonds, the high-rise buildings blazing with light, the streets still thick with traffic, though it was nearly midnight. Somewhere out there, in those elegant buildings, people were eating expensive dinners, lifting glasses of fine wine, living the kind of lives Winter had once believed she would have too. She sat down on the window ledge, her back against the cold wooden frame, still holding the black business card in her hand. Sterling Vance. She turned the card over and over in her fingers, feeling its smooth surface beneath the moonlight that slipped through the dusty glass. 24 hours, he had said, as though her life could be decided in 24 hours, as though she were a piece of merchandise with an expiration date. Winter hated this feeling, hated the feeling of being driven into a corner and forced to hold out her hands for someone else's help. She had hated it ever since she was a 19-year-old girl standing before the ashes of her parents' house, watching neighbors press money into her hand with pity in their eyes. She had hated it when she had to beg for extra work to support herself through college while friends her age were fully provided for by their parents. And she hated it now, when a boss of the underworld stood in front of her, offering her something she wasn't strong enough to refuse. I need work, not pity. She had said those words to a strange man on the street a few months earlier, when he had tried to push a few bills into her hand after seeing her and Rosie sitting on a park bench eating dry bread. She had lifted her chin and walked away, even though her stomach had been twisting with hunger, even though Rosie had tugged at her hand and asked why they weren't taking the money. And Sterling Vance had seen it. He had watched her. He had remembered. The thought sent a shiver through Winter. Not because of fear, but because of another strange feeling she didn't want to admit. He had said it was strategy, said she was only a piece on the board in his game against Preston Shaw, but his eyes when he spoke about her refusing charity money Those eyes hadn't been cold. There had been something else in them, something Winter couldn't name, something that unsettled her even more than the danger he represented. She looked down at the card again, then toward Rosie's bedroom door. The refrigerator in the kitchen was nearly empty. She still hadn't paid this month's rent. Winter was coming, and the old heater in this apartment had been broken since last year. If she accepted Sterling Vance's offer, all of those problems would disappear. Rosie would have a better life. She wouldn't have to lie awake through the night worrying about money anymore. But what would the price be? Stepping into the world of a boss of the underworld, bringing her daughter into danger, owing a man she knew nothing about except his name and the terrifying rumors that followed him. Winter closed her eyes and drew in a long, deep breath. She had survived this long without anyone. After losing her parents, she had picked herself up. After Andrew died and left behind a mountain of debt, she was still trying to pick herself up. She would keep going that way. There had to be another way. She opened her eyes and looked straight at the city lights in the distance. There had to be another way. She would find a new job. She would ask for more time to repay the debt. She would do whatever was necessary so she wouldn't have to step into Sterling Vance's world. She didn't need him. Didn't need anyone. Winter set the business card down on the table beside the window. Her resolve strengthened. Tomorrow morning she would start looking for another way. She would prove that she could take care of herself and Rosie, without leaning on anyone, especially not on a boss of the underworld with deep blue eyes and offers that seemed far too good to be real. She didn't know that somewhere else in the city, Preston Shaw was sitting in his luxurious office, swirling a glass of wine in his hand and thinking about her. Thinking about how he would make her pay for daring to let Sterling Vance protect her, even for that brief moment. Preston Shaw wasn't the kind of man who accepted humiliation in front of the whole city, and Winter Hartley had just become the target of that hatred. The next morning, Winter woke before the sun had risen. She prepared a simple breakfast for Rosie from the few things left in the refrigerator. One slice of toast spread with a little peanut butter and a glass of milk. Rosie ate happily as though it were the grandest feast in the world, her wide eyes sparkling and her broad smile smeared with peanut butter at the corners of her mouth. "Mommy, today I'm going to draw a picture for you. I'm going to draw the horse. The black horse like Grandpa's horse." Winter felt her heart tighten when she heard Rosie mention midnight. She bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead, trying to hide the pain rising inside her chest. "Go ahead and draw it, sweetheart. Mommy will hang it on the wall." Rosie's smile was the only thing keeping her standing these days. It was the reason she got up every morning, the reason she kept fighting even while life went on pushing her toward the edge of the abyss. The little girl knew nothing about the debts, about Preston Shaw, about the auction the day before. To Rosie, the world was still beautiful and full of color, and Winter would do anything to keep her daughter's world that way. She took Rosie to preschool, watched her little girl run inside with her pink backpack bouncing on her back, then turned and started walking toward the apartment. The autumn morning was crisp and cold, the wind from the sea carrying salt and the smell of seaweed. Winter pulled her thin coat tighter around herself and walked quickly along the quiet sidewalk. She was thinking about where she would go that day to ask for work, which doors she would knock on, what she would say to convince people that she deserved a chance, when a gleaming black car pulled up sharply right in front of her, blocking her path. Winter stopped short, her survival instinct making her step back. The rear door of the car opened, and Preston Shaw stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, a smile on his lips that never reached his eyes, which were as cold as stone. Two of his men stepped out from the front seat and took their places on either side of him like two silent, threatening statues. "Winter Hartley," Preston spoke, his voice as sweet as honey laced with poison. "I hear you've got a new admirer. Sterling Vance, no less. All of Crescent Bay is buzzing about you. The poor girl who caught the boss's eye. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it?" Winter straightened her back and lifted her chin even as her heart was pounding like war drums. She wouldn't let him see the fear crawling down her spine. "That's none of your business." Preston gave a dry laugh and stepped closer. He was nearly a head taller than she was, and he used that advantage on purpose to press down on her. "None of my business. You still owe me money, Miss Hartley. A lot of money. Your husband left you quite an impressive inheritance. I don't care where you get it, but you have 1 week to pay the first $200,000. $200,000 in 1 week. Winter almost wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the demand. She didn't even have $200 in her account right now, much less $200,000. But she kept her face cold, revealing nothing. And if I don't have it? Preston tilted his head as though considering an interesting question. If you don't have it, I'll make sure you never find work in this city again. No one hires the wife of a gambling addict buried in debt. You'll be thrown out of your miserable apartment. You'll wander the streets. And the others your husband owed money to? He stepped even closer, lowering his voice until it hissed like a snake. They aren't as polite as I am, Miss Hartley. They don't like to wait. Winter felt fear close around her throat like an invisible hand. But she didn't step back. She looked straight into Preston's cold gray eyes without blinking. You think Sterling Vance is going to protect you? Preston laughed, the sound like gravel scraping against glass. He's just playing a game. You're only a pawn he's using to provoke me. And when he gets bored, when the game is over, you'll be alone again. Alone with the debt and no one left to run to. Winter lifted her head even higher, her voice icy, though she was trembling inside. I don't need anyone to protect me. Preston looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she meant it or was only trying to appear strong. Then he smiled, a smile that made Winter think of a shark catching the scent of blood. 1 week, Miss Hartley. Don't make me come looking for you. Next time I won't be this polite. He turned and walked back toward the car, his 2 men following like shadows. The black car glided away, leaving Winter standing alone on the sidewalk with the sea wind whipping through her hair. Winter waited until the car had disappeared completely around the corner before allowing herself to be weak. She leaned against the cold brick wall behind her, her knees shaking, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe steadily, but Preston's threats kept echoing in her head like a song of death. 1 week. $200,000. No job. Nowhere to go. She couldn't stand against Preston Shaw. Not because she was weak, but because he had power. Men. Money. He could crush her as easily as crushing an ant beneath his heel. And she had nothing but her 2 empty hands and a 5-year-old daughter who needed to be protected. Winter opened her eyes and looked up at the gray sky shifting with the warning of coming rain. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her coat, where the black business card had been lying untouched since the night before. She took it out and looked at the phone number. Looked at the name Sterling Vance printed in silver letters. She had decided she would refuse, had told herself that she didn't need anyone, but that decision had been made before she had seen the true monster waiting for her in the dark. Preston Shaw wouldn't stop. He would ruin her, and Rosie would suffer the consequences. Winter dialed the number on her phone, her hand trembling slightly. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Then the familiar deep voice came through, calm as though he had known she would call. Miss Hartley. Winter swallowed the knot in her throat, her voice steady even as she fought back tears. Is your offer still good? Silence. Long enough for Winter to think he had hung up. Then Sterling spoke. You changed your mind. I didn't change. Winter drew in a long breath. I just don't have any other choice left. Another pause. Then Sterling's voice came again, and Winter could have sworn she heard something else in it. Something almost gentle. Sometimes having no choice is the best choice. I'll send a car for you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Then the line went dead. Winter lowered the phone and looked up at the gray sky growing darker with every passing minute. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold against her skin. She had just stepped into Sterling Vance's world. She didn't know whether heaven or hell was waiting for her there, but between Sterling's hell and Preston's hell, she had chosen the man she could look in the eye without feeling sick. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a gleaming black car pulled up in front of the door of Winter's attic apartment. She had been awake since early dawn, packing her things and Rosie's into 2 small suitcases, explaining to her daughter that they were going to a new place, a place with a large garden to play in, and maybe even dogs. Rosie had jumped up and down with excitement because she loved dogs, and Winter had tried to smile even though her heart was full of dread. The driver, dressed in a black suit, opened the car door for them and didn't say a single word for the entire ride. The car glided through the crowded streets of Crescent Bay, past the bustling business district, past rows of buildings that grew sparser and sparser, then began climbing the winding coastal hill road. Rosie sat beside her mother with her eyes fixed to the window, gasping with delight each time she saw the sparkling blue sea below. At last, the car stopped in front of a towering iron gate. The gate slowly opened, and Winter saw the Vance estate for the first time. The mansion sat on top of the hill like some giant sleeping beast, its architecture blending modern lines with classical elegance, glass and granite reflecting the morning sunlight, and behind it, the deep blue ocean stretching all the way to the horizon. The car stopped in front of the main entrance, and the moment Winter stepped out, she saw a man already waiting on the steps. He was tall and broad-shouldered, standing as straight and solid as an oak that no storm could bend. His face was sharp and cold as stone, his hair cut short in a military style, and his brown eyes swept over Winter with the assessing look of a soldier searching for hidden danger. Knox Mercer. The man spoke only 2 words in a deep, dry voice. "Follow me." Winter took Rosie's hand, feeling her daughter's small, warm fingers tighten around her own. They followed Knox through the heavy wooden doors and into the mansion. The main hall was vast, with towering ceilings, polished white marble floors, paintings hanging on the walls, and fresh flowers arranged on small tables. Luxurious and flawless, yet Winter could feel a certain coldness there, as though this house lacked the warmth of a real family, as though it were only a beautiful shell hiding emptiness inside. Footsteps sounded from the staircase. Winter looked up and saw Sterling descending, still wearing the same flawless black suit as the day before, still carrying that cold, unreadable expression. But something was different. Beside him walked a massive dog with silver-gray fur, standing nearly to Sterling's waist, moving with the grave majesty of a king patrolling his own land. An Irish wolfhound, Winter realized, one of the largest dog breeds in the world. The dog stopped the moment it saw Winter and Rosie, its golden eyes fixed on them, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. Rosie stepped back and hid behind her mother's leg, though her eyes remained wide with curiosity as she looked at the dog. Ghost. Sterling placed a hand on the dog's head, and the growling stopped at once. The dog was still alert, but it sat down beside its master's leg, never taking its eyes off Winter. "She is a guest." Sterling spoke to the dog as though it could understand him, "and this little girl is too." Ghost tilted its head and studied Rosie for a long moment, then turned to look at Sterling as though confirming the order. Winter wondered whether she was imagining things, or whether the dog was truly that frighteningly intelligent. Sterling turned toward her and gave a brief nod of greeting. "Follow me." He led them through long hallways, past rooms that Winter only had time to glimpse, until at last he stopped in front of a bright room in the west wing of the mansion. The room had large windows overlooking the lush green garden outside, sunlight pouring in and creating a warm space completely different from the rest of the house. An oak desk stood near the window, and a computer and office equipment had already been prepared. "This is your office," Sterling said. "You'll manage the books for my legitimate companies. Real estate, restaurants, clubs. Everything is clean on paper. You don't need to worry about anything beyond the numbers." Winter nodded, but her mind was on something else. "What about Rosie?" she asked, unable to hide the worry in her voice. "Where will she stay while I'm working?" Sterling looked at her for a moment, then turned and stepped back into the hallway, gesturing for her to follow. They walked to the east wing of the mansion, where another room was waiting. It was decorated in soft pink and white, with a small bed covered in a princess blanket, a corner full of toys, and a window overlooking the garden where a swing and a little slide stood outside. Rosie gave a cry of delight, let go of her mother's hand, and ran into the room, her eyes shining as she took in the pile of toys. Winter stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. "Mrs. Bellamy will watch over her when you're busy," Sterling said, his voice still calm and even. "She used to be the housekeeper at Blackwood Stables. I invited her here. The garden is safe for play. And Ghost," he looked at the dog standing by the door, "will keep watch." Winter turned to Sterling, her emotions in turmoil. "Why did you prepare all of this so carefully?" she asked, her voice rougher now. "Did you know I would agree?" Sterling didn't answer right away. He looked at Rosie, who was hugging a stuffed bear nearly half her size, then turned and walked toward the door. "I didn't know," he said without looking back, "but I hoped." Then he walked away, and Ghost slowly rose to follow his master. But before leaving the room, the dog stopped and turned its head to look at Winter for a long moment with those deep golden eyes, as though it were judging her, as though it were deciding whether she was worthy of being in this house. Then it turned away and disappeared around the hallway corner with Sterling. Winter stood there, looking around the room that had been prepared with such careful attention to every smallest detail for her daughter, and wondered what kind of world she had just entered. A boss of the underworld preparing a princess bedroom for a 5-year-old child. A man feared by the entire city hiring a housekeeper to care for the daughter of a penniless widow. Who was Sterling Vance, and why did he care about her this much? 1 week passed more quickly than Winter had expected. She gradually grew used to the work, to the bright office overlooking the garden, to the numbers on the computer screen and the neatly arranged files in the drawers. The work wasn't difficult for her, because she had once been an accountant for a large investment firm before everything fell apart. Sterling kept his promise. Everything she had to handle involved legitimate businesses, real estate, fine restaurants, nightclubs. Nothing had anything to do with the underworld, at least not on paper. Rosie had stayed in the old apartment during that first week with Mrs. Bellamy watching over her, because Winter had wanted to make sure this mansion was safe before bringing her daughter there. But today, for the first time, she decided to bring Rosie with her. The little girl was excited the entire drive, her eyes wide as she stared at the magnificent estate when the car passed through the iron gates. "Wow, Mommy, this house is as big as a castle," Rosie exclaimed, her small hand pressed against the window. "Is there a princess here, Mommy?" Winter smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. "There isn't a princess here, sweetheart, but there's a big garden to play in." Mrs. Bellamy greeted them at the door, her kind face lit by a warm smile. She led Rosie out to the garden in the back, while Winter went into the office to work. She sat down at the desk, turned on the computer, and began reviewing the latest financial reports. But every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the window, looking out at the garden where her daughter was playing. Rosie was running across the lush green lawn, picking wildflowers and chasing butterflies as they fluttered through the air. Mrs. Bellamy sat in a chair nearby, smiling as she watched the child. Everything was peaceful, until Rosie saw Ghost. The dog was lying in the sun near the rose bushes at the corner of the garden, his silver-gray coat gleaming beneath the light. He was enormous, almost as tall as Rosie even while lying down, and if he stood up, he would likely be taller than her head. Winter saw Rosie stop, her eyes widening as she stared at the dog. Then the little girl began running toward Ghost. Mrs. Bellamy jumped to her feet, her face draining of color. "Rosie, don't," she called out, her voice full of alarm. "That dog doesn't like strangers." But it was already too late. Rosie had reached Ghost and was standing right in front of the giant dog with a bright smile on her face. Winter stopped breathing, her hand gripping the window frame. She was about to run downstairs, about to shout, about to do anything to protect her daughter, but then something strange happened. Ghost lifted his head and looked at Rosie with those golden eyes, and instead of growling the way he always did, the dog only tilted his head to one side, studying the child in front of him with a curious expression. Then his long tail began to wag gently back and forth over the grass. Rosie squealed with delight, plopped down beside Ghost, and began petting his silky gray fur. "He's so big," she said, her voice full of wonder. "His fur is soft like a cloud." "Mommy, do you see him?" Mrs. Bellamy stood there with her mouth open, unable to believe what she was seeing. She had worked here long enough to know that Ghost never let anyone come near him except Sterling. Even Knox, who had been at Sterling's side for years, had never been allowed to touch the dog. And yet a 5-year-old child was sitting there, hugging Ghost as though he were an enormous stuffed toy. Winter was no less astonished. She looked at her daughter and the dog through the window, her heart still racing with fear but now filled with amazement as well. Rosie was laughing, talking to Ghost as though he could understand every word she said. And Ghost was lying there quietly, allowing the child to stroke him, his golden eyes resting on Rosie with something almost like gentleness in them. Sterling appeared from the corner of the garden. He was taking a walk, perhaps part of his morning routine, when he saw the scene before him and came to an abrupt stop. His dog, the dog who had never allowed anyone but Sterling to come near, was lying there letting a strange child wrap her arms around him. Rosie heard footsteps and looked up. When she saw Sterling, she wasn't frightened the way most people were when they faced the boss of the Vance Empire. Instead, she got to her feet and ran toward him with a radiant smile. "Mister, what is your dog's name?" Rosie asked, tipping her head back to look at the tall man standing before her. Sterling looked down at the child, and there was something on his face that Winter had never seen before. Confusion, unease, as though he didn't know what to do with those wide eyes and that innocent smile turned toward him. "Ghost," he answered after a pause. "Ghost." Rosie tilted her head, wearing the thoughtful expression of a 5-year-old trying to make sense of something. "That means a ghost. Why did you name him Ghost?" "He isn't scary. He's cute." Sterling was silent for a moment, and then Winter saw the corner of his mouth lift just slightly. But it was the first smile she had ever seen on that face, that was always cold as ice. Because he moves very quietly, he explained, his voice still low but softer somehow. No one hears him coming. I hear him, Rosie argued at once, her little face suddenly serious. I have very sharp ears. Mommy says I can even hear ants crawling. Sterling stood there in silence. The boss of the Vance Empire, the man who made all of Crescent Bay tremble, was standing awkwardly in front of a 5-year-old child who didn't know what fear was. Is that so? He said at last, and Winter almost laughed at the helplessness in his voice. Can you pick Ghost up? Rosie asked next, clearly having no intention of letting him off easily. I want to hug him. Sterling looked at the dog, then at the child, with an expression as though he had just been asked the most difficult question in the world. Ghost is very heavy, he said, and he doesn't like being picked up. Rosie thought for a moment, then shrugged. Then I'll just hug his leg. And with that, she turned and ran back to Ghost, wrapping her arms around one of the giant dog's front legs. Ghost stood still and let the child hold on to him, and if a dog could look at someone with patience and indulgence, then that was exactly the way Ghost was looking at Rosie now. Sterling stood there watching the scene in front of him, and Winter could see that he had absolutely no idea how he was supposed to react. He had faced enemies, danger, situations balanced between life and death, but he had never faced the unconditional innocence of a child, and that, in some strange way, seemed to leave him more lost than even the fiercest battles ever had. Winter stood by the window, looking down at the 3 figures in the garden, the cold man, the giant dog, and the tiny child hugging the dog's leg with a glowing smile on her face. And for the first time since stepping into this mansion, she smiled. A real smile, rising from the deepest part of her heart. Maybe this place wasn't as frightening as she had imagined. 2 weeks passed, and Winter gradually grew used to the new rhythm of life at the Vance estate. Every morning she woke early, got Rosie ready for school, then sat down at her desk in the bright office overlooking the garden. The numbers on the computer screen became familiar. The files no longer felt foreign, and she began to find something almost like peace in this work. One afternoon, Winter left the estate earlier than usual to pick up a few belongings still left behind in the old apartment. She drove the small car Sterling had provided for her, passing through the familiar streets of Crescent Bay. On the way back, she took a side road on the outskirts of the city, a place she had never been before, and then she saw a familiar car parked in front of the gate of a low building, Sterling's gleaming black car. Winter slowed down, curious and a little uneasy. She parked some distance away, slipped behind a large tree, and watched. The building in front of her was an orphanage. She realized from the sign hanging on the gate. Sterling stepped out of the car with a thick envelope in his hand and walked toward a middle-aged woman waiting at the entrance, most likely the director. He handed her the envelope and exchanged a few brief words with her. The woman took it with a face full of gratitude, thanking him again and again. She said something else, perhaps inviting Sterling inside to visit the children. But Sterling shook his head. No, Winter couldn't hear clearly, but she saw his lips move. I don't want the children to know where this money came from. Just say it's from the charity fund. Then he turned away and walked back to the car without looking back, even though the woman was still thanking him behind him. He got in, and the black car glided away, leaving the woman standing there with the envelope of money in her hands and emotion shining in her eyes. Winter remained behind the tree, watching Sterling's car disappear around the bend. She stood there for a long time, thinking about what she had just seen. Sterling Vance, the boss of Crescent Bay's underworld, the man the entire city feared, was quietly donating to an orphanage, and he didn't want anyone to know, didn't want to be thanked, didn't want to be seen as a good man. Maybe the monster the whole city feared was trying to do what many decent people never did, and he was hiding it as though it were some shameful secret. Winter quietly returned to her car and drove back to the estate with her thoughts in turmoil. She thought about Sterling, about those cold, deep blue eyes, about his low, emotionless voice, about the way he became awkward around Rosie, and now about the thick envelope he had handed over to the orphanage. Who was he really? A dangerous man she should stay far away from, or a man trying to do good in the dark? She didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing. The way she looked at Sterling had changed. It was no longer only fear and caution. Something else was beginning to stir inside her, something she still wasn't ready to name. 1 month passed, and the thing Winter had never imagined would happen finally did. One weekend afternoon, while she was sitting in her office reviewing the last reports of the week. Knox appeared in the doorway and told her she should come out to the stables. She followed him, her heart full of questions, and when she stepped through the wooden gate leading into the estate's riding grounds, she stopped dead in her tracks. Midnight was standing there, in a brand new stall with golden straw spread thick beneath his feet. The black Frisian lifted his head at the sound of her footsteps, his long, glossy mane stirring softly in the evening breeze, his dark eyes fixed on her as though he recognized a familiar soul. Her father's horse, the last keepsake, the horse she had thought she had lost forever. Sterling had kept his word. He had brought Midnight back to her. Winter walked to the stall, her trembling hand reaching out to touch Midnight's mane. The horse snorted softly and rubbed his head against her palm, as though telling her he remembered her too. Tears rose and burned behind her eyes, but she held them back, swallowing the tight ache in her throat. "Mommy, the horse is so beautiful." Rosie's voice rang out from behind her. Winter turned and saw her daughter running toward her, her wide eyes shining as she stared at Midnight. "I want to ride him. Mommy, let me ride him." Winter hesitated. She had once known how to ride. Her father had taught her when she was little on this very horse, but it had been too long, almost 10 years since the last time she had sat in a saddle. And Rosie was still too small. She didn't dare take the risk. "You're still too little, Rosie," she said gently. "Maybe when you're older, I can teach her." The familiar deep voice came from behind her. Winter turned and saw Sterling stepping out from inside the stable, as though he had been waiting there for some time. "If you allow it," he added, his eyes resting on her with something she couldn't name. Before Winter could answer, Rosie gave a joyful squeal and ran to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, teach me." The little girl grabbed his hand and tugged at it. "I want to learn. I promise I'll be good." Sterling looked down at the child clutching his hand, then looked up at Winter with an expression that almost seemed to ask permission. She looked at her daughter, looked at the horse, then looked at the man standing there waiting for her answer. And she nodded. "All right." Sterling led Midnight out of the stall and brought him to an open stretch of ground nearby. He checked the saddle straps, adjusted the stirrups, every movement practiced and careful. Then he turned to Rosie and crouched down to her eye level. "Are you ready?" "Ready." Rosie nodded eagerly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Sterling lifted her into the air, gently as though he were handling something precious, and placed her on the saddle. Rosie let out a soft, delighted cry, her hands gripping Midnight's mane tightly, but there wasn't a trace of fear in her. Sterling stood beside her, one hand holding the reins, the other resting behind Rosie's back to steady her. "Keep your back straight," he said, his voice gentle in a way Winter had never heard before. "Hold on to the mane. Don't be afraid. Midnight is very kind. You're kind, aren't you, horsey?" Rosie bent down and patted Midnight's neck. "I'm not scared. I'm very brave. Mommy says so." Sterling led Midnight slowly around the open ground, one hand still supporting Rosie's back, his steps steady and patient. The sunset poured down over them, washing the three figures in gold and amber, the gleaming black horse, Rosie's brown curls, Sterling's black suit. Ghost lay nearby in the grass, his golden eyes following them, loyally standing guard like a silent bodyguard. Winter stood by the wooden fence, watching the scene before her. Rosie was laughing, her clear, bright laughter drifting through the garden. Sterling was saying something to her, his voice low and soft, and Rosie was nodding like a dutiful little student. They looked like father and daughter. The thought came to Winter without warning, and her chest tightened. She remembered her own father, remembered afternoons like this, when he led her on Midnight's back, when he taught her how to hold the reins, when he told her that his daughter was the bravest girl in the world. Afternoons full of golden sunlight and laughter. Afternoons she had once thought would last forever until the fire took everything away. And now Rosie was having something she had been missing for so long, the shape of a father, something Andrew, her husband, had never given her. Andrew had always been too busy with card games, with debts, with promises made and broken. He had never given Rosie time like this, had never looked at her with the patience and tenderness Sterling was showing now. Tears slipped down Winter's cheeks before she even realized it. She quickly raised a hand to wipe them away, not wanting anyone to see, but it was already too late. "Mommy, Mr. Sterling teaches so well," Rosie called out, her smile shining. "I want to learn every day. Can I, Mommy?" Sterling stopped and turned to look at Winter. His eyes met hers, and she knew he had seen her tears, but he didn't ask why, didn't mention them. He only looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then said softly, "If her mother allows it." Winter swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes," she said, her voice a little rough. "Go ahead and learn, Rosie." Sterling gave a small nod and said nothing more, then turned back and continued leading Midnight forward. He didn't ask about the tears, didn't ask about the past, didn't ask why she had cried while watching her daughter being taught to ride. Some emotions don't need explaining, and perhaps he understood that. Winter stood there watching Sterling and Rosie beneath the sunset, and she realized that her heart was beginning to thaw, little by little, like spring snow melting beneath warm sunlight, even if she didn't want to admit it. Late that night, Winter couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, her mind turning over again and again to the image of Sterling teaching Rosie to ride beneath the sunset. The picture had been so beautiful it hurt, and she didn't understand why it made her feel that way. At last she gave up, pulled on a thin sweater, and stepped out of her room. The mansion lay silent in the night, moonlight filtering through the glass windows and casting silver streaks across the marble floor. Her feet carried her almost without thought to the library, the room she had discovered a few weeks earlier, where thousands of books filled old oak shelves from floor to ceiling. But when she drew near, she saw light spilling through the narrow opening of the door. Someone was inside. Winter hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped in. Sterling was sitting in a brown leather armchair beside the fireplace, a book in his hand, the flickering firelight casting warmth across the sharp planes of his face. Ghost lay at his master's feet, his golden eyes lifting when Winter appeared, but the dog didn't growl. He only looked at her for a moment, and then rested his head back down. Sterling didn't seem surprised to see her. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, then lowered them again to the page. "You can't sleep either." It wasn't a question, only an observation. Winter nodded, even though he wasn't looking at her, then crossed the room and sat down in the chair opposite him. The fire crackled softly in the grate, sending out a comforting warmth into the cool autumn night. She sat there looking into the flames, saying nothing. Sterling said nothing either. The silence between them wasn't heavy or awkward. Strangely, it felt comfortable, as though they were both used to being alone at night, and the presence of the other didn't disturb that solitude but only made the darkness feel a little less lonely. "Are you always awake this late?" Winter spoke after a long while, her eyes still on the fire. "I rarely sleep before 3 o'clock in the morning," Sterling answered, his voice even. "I'm used to it." "Since when?" "A very long time." He said nothing more, and Winter didn't ask anything more. She understood that feeling. The sleepless nights, the memories that refused to let go, the thoughts circling the mind like moths throwing themselves into flame. She had nights like that too, many of them. The sound of the fire filled the silence. Ghost sighed in his sleep, one front leg twitching slightly as though he were dreaming. Sterling set his book down and looked into the flames, and when he spoke, his voice was low and distant, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "My father owed money. One night, everything changed. I lost everything." Winter stayed silent. She didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask what he had lost, didn't ask what he had endured. Some wounds don't need to be cut open with words. She understood that better than anyone. "Harrison Vance found me when I had nothing left," Sterling continued, his voice still far away. "He gave me purpose, gave me a name, gave me this empire." He paused for a moment, "But he died 5 years ago." Winter looked at him. In the firelight, Sterling's face wasn't as cold as it usually was. There was something softer there, sadder, more human, and she understood. He hadn't been born the boss of Crescent Bay's underworld. He had become that man in order to survive, just as she had been forced to become strong in order to survive, just as she had built walls around herself so no one could ever hurt her that deeply again. "I lost my parents in a fire when I was 19, she said, her voice light as breath. "Everyone thought it was an accident. I had to pull myself up alone after that. Then I met Andrew and thought he was my savior." She gave a bitter little laugh. Turned out he was only another nightmare. Sterling looked at her. For the first time, she saw that his eyes were no longer blocks of deep blue ice. There was something in them now, understanding, sympathy, something she had never expected to find in a man like him. "You're stronger than you think, Winter," he said softly. Winter looked at him, and for reasons she couldn't explain. She smiled. "And you're kinder than you want people to believe," she said. Sterling didn't answer. He only looked at her, the firelight reflected in his deep blue eyes, softening them like the surface of a lake in autumn. And in that moment, they looked at each other, truly saw each other. Not a widow drowning in debt and a powerful boss. Not a weak woman and a strong man. Just two human beings who had lost everything and were trying to keep living. Two wounded souls finding one another in the dark. Ghost suddenly rose, walked a few steps, then lay down between their chairs. The dog rested his head on Winter's leg, his golden eyes lifting to her with something almost like trust in them. It was the first time he had ever shown affection to anyone besides Sterling. Sterling looked at Ghost, then at Winter, and she could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth lift slightly. "He likes you," he said. "He doesn't like anyone. Maybe he has good taste," Winter answered, and this time they both smiled. Small smiles, quiet ones, but real. They sat there until nearly dawn, sometimes speaking of little things, sometimes falling silent as they watched the fire burn. There were no grand words, no promises, nothing except the presence of each other in the night. And that was their first moment of intimacy. Not of the body, but of the soul. Two strangers beginning to become something more than strangers. Something neither of them dared to name. 2 months passed, and life at the Vance estate had become the new normal for Winter and Rosie. The damp attic apartment was now only a distant memory, replaced by bright rooms, a wide garden, and Rosie's laughter echoing through the hallways every day. The little girl had adapted with astonishing ease, as though this estate had always been her home. Rosie now called Sterling Mr. Sterling instead of the strange man she had once feared. She played with Ghost every day, and the two of them, one child and one dog, had become inseparable best friends. Every weekend, Sterling taught Rosie how to ride Midnight, and the little girl improved so quickly that it was startling. Winter often stood by the fence watching them, and each time her heart tightened with a feeling she still didn't dare name. One evening, Winter was sitting in her office, reviewing a few reports, when Rosie came running in, waving a sheet of paper through the air. "Mommy, look what I drew," the little girl cried, her eyes shining with pride. "I worked on it all afternoon, Mommy." Winter set down her pen and turned to take the paper from her daughter's hands. She looked at the picture, and her heart seemed to stop for one beat. On the page were the scribbled lines of a 5-year-old child, bright colors with no sense of proportion at all. But she could recognize every figure. A woman with long brown hair, that was her. A tiny little girl standing in the middle with a smile stretching all the way across her face, that was Rosie. A tall man dressed in black with dark hair and eyes that Rosie had colored blue, that was Sterling. And a huge gray dog standing beside the man, that was Ghost. All 4 figures were holding hands, or at least that was what Rosie had tried to show with her still clumsy drawing skills. "Who did you draw here, Rosie?" Winter asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. "You, me, and Mr. Sterling with Ghost," Rosie answered innocently, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is our family. I drew it so we can hang it on the wall. Family." The word echoed in Winter's mind like a bell. Her daughter, that innocent 5-year-old child, had seen what Winter herself didn't dare face. Rosie had accepted Sterling as part of their family, had drawn him into the picture of the people she loved most. Tears stung Winter's eyes, but she held them back. She pulled Rosie into her arms and kissed her soft curls. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered. "It's so beautiful." Rosie grinned, hugged her mother tightly, then ran off to play with Ghost, who was waiting outside the door. Winter remained there alone, looking down at the picture in her hands. She didn't know how to face what it meant, didn't know what to say to Sterling, or whether she should say anything at all. In the end, she folded the drawing and tucked it away in the drawer of her desk. But that night, as she passed Sterling's study on her way back to her bedroom, Winter saw light still spilling through the narrow opening of the door. She meant to keep walking, but something made her stop. She looked through the crack, and what she saw rooted her to the spot. Sterling was sitting at his desk, but there were no papers or computers in front of him. Instead, there was a small sheet of paper, a sheet Winter recognized at once, Rosie's drawing. Knox must have found it and brought it to him. Sterling sat there in silence, his fingers brushing lightly over the clumsy little lines. His face, that face always so cold and unreadable, softened in a way Winter had never seen before. There was something fragile in his eyes, something like longing, something like emotion he was trying to hide but couldn't. Sterling Vance, the boss who made the entire city tremble, was sitting there deeply moved by the scribbled drawing of a 5-year-old child, because for the first time in his life, someone had drawn him into their family picture. Winter quietly stepped away without letting Sterling know she had seen. She returned to her room, lay down on the bed, and stared up at the ceiling in the darkness. Her heart was beating fast, and she didn't know whether it was because of what she had just witnessed or because of what she was beginning to feel. She didn't know that night Sterling placed the drawing into the drawer of his desk, the drawer locked with care, the place where he kept the things most precious to him. For the first time, something other than papers and money was being kept inside that drawer. 3 months passed, and Winter had become an indispensable part of the Vance empire, at least on the legal financial side of it. She managed the books for more than a dozen different companies, from luxury real estate to restaurant chains, from high-end nightclubs to investment projects. The work was heavy and complex, but Winter found herself being challenged in a way she hadn't experienced since losing her old job. She was good at this, and more importantly, she liked it. Late one night, when Rosie was fast asleep and the mansion had fallen silent, Winter sat in her office reviewing a new set of financial reports. She was checking the income and expenses of a real estate company when she noticed something unusual, a chain of transactions that didn't match the normal flow of money. Funds moving through multiple accounts, weaving through shell companies, going overseas and then circling back, like a maze designed to hide the final destination. Winter frowned and began tracing it. She opened more files, compared the figures, and sketched out the connections on a blank sheet of paper. The professional accounting skills she had built over years of working at the investment firm began to show their worth. She could see patterns other people might miss, figures that didn't line up in ways only a trained eye would catch. And then she found it. The final destination of the money trail. One name. Preston Shaw. Winter sat still for a moment, staring at the name on the computer screen. Preston Shaw was laundering money. Tens of millions of dollars were flowing through shell companies, through international banks, and finally into his hands. Clear evidence, detailed evidence, enough to send him to prison if it ever came to light. She didn't sleep that night. She spent the entire night putting everything together into one complete file, carefully documenting every transaction, every number, every path the money had taken. By the time dawn broke through the window, she had a thick folder in her hands, undeniable proof of Preston Shaw's money laundering operation. The next morning, Winter went to see Sterling in his study. She placed the file on his desk and looked at him calmly. "I found this." Sterling frowned, picked up the file, and began reading. Winter watched his face as he turned each page, and saw those deep blue eyes grow brighter with every page he read. He didn't speak until he reached the final page. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen before. Surprise, real surprise. He pressed the button to call Knox in. The tall man appeared within seconds, and Sterling handed the file to him. "Check this." Knox took it, flipped through a few pages, and Winter saw his brow rise even though his face remained cold as stone. He spent about 10 minutes reviewing it, then gave Sterling a nod. "The evidence is solid, enough to bring in the FBI. He's finished." Sterling nodded and signaled for Knox to leave. Then he turned back to Winter and looked at her for a long moment. "You just did what my entire team has been trying to do for 2 years, he said, his voice low. 2 years, Winter, and you found it in one night." Winter gave a small shrug, though there was a spark of pride inside her that she didn't want to admit. "I just know how to read numbers," she said. "Your team was looking in the wrong place. They were looking for evidence of underground activity, for obvious illegal operations. I looked at the books, where everything has to pass through if it's going to be made legal. Dirty money trying to become clean money always leaves a trace. I just followed that trace." Sterling looked at her, and Winter saw something change in his eyes. It was no longer the look of a boss gazing down at an employee. This was the look of respect. "You're intelligent," he said simply. Winter was silent for a moment, then spoke, her voice firmer. "No, I just want him to pay for what he did to me, to my family." She paused. "He threatened me. He wanted to destroy my life. I haven't forgotten any of it." Sterling nodded, as if he understood. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the garden beyond. "I'll hand the evidence to the lawyers so they can pass it to the FBI the legal way," he said. "But you need to be ready. Preston will know, and he'll retaliate." Winter stood and walked over to stand beside him. She looked out at the garden, where Rosie was playing with Ghost beneath the bright morning sun, then turned to look at Sterling. "I've been ready since the day I walked into this house," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I'm not afraid of him. Not anymore." Sterling looked at her, and Winter saw something new in his eyes. It was no longer the look given to someone who needed protection. This was the look reserved for an ally, for someone standing on the same side of the line. Winter Hartley was no longer only the accountant of the Vance empire. She was Sterling's ally, and she had chosen her side. 1 week passed after Winter handed the evidence file to Sterling. Everything seemed peaceful, and life continued with its familiar rhythm at the Vance estate. Rosie still played with Ghost every day, still learned to ride every weekend. Winter still worked in the bright office overlooking the garden, still ate dinner with Sterling in the comfortable silence that had become familiar between them. But a storm was coming, and Winter had no idea. That morning, while she was sitting in her office checking a few reports, Mrs. Bellamy knocked on the door and handed her an envelope. "Someone sent this for you, ma'am," she said. No sender's name. Winter took the envelope and frowned. It was white, with no return address and no postal mark. Someone had delivered it here by hand. She thanked Mrs. Bellamy, waited until the older woman left, then opened it. Inside were 3 things: a stack of photographs, a set of papers that looked like an official report, and a small slip of paper with a scrawled handwritten note. Winter looked at the photographs first, and her heart felt as though it were being crushed in someone's fist. They were pictures of the scene of a fire, a house burned to ruin, nothing left but blackened walls and piles of wreckage. She recognized that house. Even though 8 years had passed, even though she had tried so hard to forget, she still recognized it. It was her parents' house, the house where she had grown up, the house the flames had consumed along with her parents on that fateful night 8 years ago. Winter set the photographs down, her hand trembling as she picked up the report. It was a fire department investigation report, a document she had never seen before. She read it line by line, and with every line, her world fell apart a little more. The fire showed signs of being deliberate. An accelerant had been found at the scene. The investigation had been underway, then had been abruptly shut down after 2 weeks. Reason: insufficient evidence to continue. Someone had interfered. Someone had forced the case closed before the truth could come to light. And on the final page, there was one note. Last person seen with the victims before the fire: Garrett Cole, business partner. Winter picked up the small slip of paper and read the handwritten line: "Your parents didn't die in an accident. Ask the right person." The note slipped from her hand, then the photographs, then the report. Everything fell to the floor like autumn leaves, and Winter sat there staring at them, unable to believe what she had just read. 8 years. For 8 years, she had believed it was an accident, believed her parents had simply been unlucky, simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had cried, she had grieved, she had cursed fate, she had pulled herself back up alone and kept going, but never, not once, had she imagined that someone had been behind it, that someone had deliberately taken her parents from her, that their deaths had not been fate but a conspiracy. Tears ran down Winter's cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She slid off the chair and collapsed onto the floor, her shoulders shaking with broken sobs. She had no strength left to stand, no strength left to think, no strength left to do anything except sit there and cry for the truth she had discovered after 8 long years. Sterling found her like that. He came into the office because there was something he needed to discuss, and he saw her curled on the floor, papers scattered around her, her shoulders trembling with each sob. He didn't need to ask to know that something terrible had happened. He walked over, sat down beside her, and said nothing. Ghost came in behind him. The dog moved to her side and lay down close against her, resting his massive head on her leg as if trying to comfort her. His golden eyes looked up at her with something almost like understanding. "I thought it was an accident," Winter whispered, her voice shattered. "For 8 years I thought it was an accident. I thought my parents were just unlucky. I thought..." She couldn't go on. Tears closed her throat. Sterling picked up the papers from the floor and read through them quickly. His face showed no emotion, but Winter saw his jaw tighten when he reached Garrett Cole's name. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice low. "Preston." Winter answered, bitterness filling her voice. He wanted me to hurt. He wanted me to know the truth so I'd hurt more. He's retaliating because I found the proof of his money laundering. Sterling was silent for a long moment. Then he took her hand. His hand was warm and steady, like an anchor holding her in place while the storm tore through her soul. Garrett Cole, he said, his voice low. I know him. He's one of Preston's allies, his business partner in several real estate deals. Winter looked up, her eyes red, tears still clinging to her cheeks. He took my parents from me? She asked, her voice breaking apart. He did that, all these years, and I didn't know. Sterling looked at her, and Winter saw something change in those deep blue eyes. They grew darker, colder, more dangerous. This was no longer the man who gently taught Rosie to ride, or sat reading with her in the library deep into the night. This was Sterling Vance, the boss of Crescent Bay's underworld. And someone had just touched something that mattered to him. He'll pay, Sterling said, his voice cold as ice, though his hand still held hers tightly. I promise you. Preston and Garrett, both of them will pay. He stood, walked to the door, and called for Knox. When the tall man appeared, Sterling gave the order in a voice that left no room for argument. Investigate Garrett Cole, everything on him. I want to know what he eats, where he sleeps, who he does business with, and find the link between him and the fire at the Hartley family home 8 years ago. Knox nodded once and disappeared. Sterling turned back to look at Winter, still sitting on the floor with Ghost beside her. She didn't know what to do with this truth, didn't know how to face it. But when she looked up at Sterling, into the eyes burning with fierce resolve, she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. That night, Winter couldn't sleep. She didn't want to be alone in that vast room either, with thoughts spiraling through her mind like an endless storm. She wandered down to the library, the place where they had shared their first real conversation many weeks earlier, and she wasn't surprised to find Sterling already there. He was sitting in the familiar armchair by the fireplace, as though he had known she would come, or perhaps he couldn't sleep either. Winter didn't say anything. She only walked over and sat down on the sofa across from him. She drew her legs up, wrapped her arms around a pillow, and stared into the flames crackling softly in the fireplace. Her eyes were still swollen from crying all afternoon, but now she had no tears left. There was only emptiness and a weariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. Ghost rose from where he had been lying at Sterling's feet, came to Winter, and lay down by her feet. The great dog rested his heavy head on her foot, his golden eyes lifting to her with something almost like comfort in them. He hadn't left her side for even a moment since she had fallen apart in the office that afternoon. Sterling didn't speak. He just sat there in silence, but his presence was steady as a stone in the middle of a storm. He didn't try to offer hollow words of comfort. He didn't ask if she was all right when it was painfully obvious that she wasn't. He was simply there. And somehow, that was enough. My father was a small merchant, Winter said after a long while, her voice quiet and exhausted. He traded fabrics in a small town outside Crescent Bay. We weren't rich, but we lived comfortably. My mother was a literature teacher at the high school. She loved books and poetry, and she passed that love on to me. She paused, staring into the fire as though she were looking straight into the past. We didn't have much money, but my family was full of laughter. I remember evenings when my mother cooked in the kitchen, the smell of food filling the whole house. I remember my father sitting beside my bed and reading to me before I fell asleep, his voice low and warm and full of love. I remember summers at the sea, the three of us building sandcastles and chasing one another through the waves. I remember what it felt like to be loved without conditions, to be safe, to belong somewhere. Her voice caught for a moment, but she didn't cry. She had cried enough already. After they died, I made it through on my own. I supported myself through college with part-time jobs. I built a career for myself from nothing. I worked 12 hours a day, sometimes more, just so I wouldn't have time to think, just so I wouldn't have to face the empty house and the silence. She drew in a deep breath. Then I met Andrew. He appeared at exactly the moment when I was loneliest and said all the right things. I thought he was my savior. I thought at last I had someone to lean on, someone to share my life with. She gave a bitter laugh. It turned out he was only another nightmare. Winter turned to look at Sterling, and for the first time she said aloud the thing she had never said to anyone. I always thought I was strong. I was proud of surviving everything on my own, but tonight I realized something. She paused, her voice trembling faintly. "I've never really faced the pain. I've only been running from it. Running from it for 8 years through work, through constant busyness, through building a wall around myself so no one could ever get inside." Sterling listened without interrupting. He watched her with those deep blue eyes, the firelight reflecting in them and scattering faint sparks of gold. Only when she had finished did he speak, his voice low and soft. "I understand that feeling, losing everything and wondering why you're still here, wondering what it even means to keep going when everything you loved is gone." Winter looked at him and saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Fragility, loneliness, a wound that looked too much like her own. "Have you found the answer yet?" she asked softly. "Why you keep going?" Sterling looked at her for a long moment, the firelight dancing in his deep blue eyes. "I'm still searching," he said, and Winter didn't know why, but she had the sudden feeling that whatever answer he was searching for had something to do with her. The air between them shifted. There was something denser in it now, something more intimate. Winter didn't realize when they had moved so close to each other, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Sterling lifted his hand, and Winter didn't pull away when his fingers touched her cheek, gently wiping away the tears still clinging there. The rough hand of a boss of the underworld, a hand that had surely done terrible things, was unexpectedly gentle when it touched her. Winter closed her eyes and leaned her face into his palm as though searching for warmth, searching for the safety she had lost so long ago. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. This moment was more intimate than any kiss, deeper than any touch. Two wounded souls finding each other in the dark, finding comfort in the presence of the other. Winter didn't know when she finally fell asleep. When she opened her eyes, dawn was already near, the first pale light slipping through the library windows. She realized that her head was resting against Sterling's shoulder, and one of his arms was wrapped around her shoulders. He was still sitting there, unmoving through the entire night, his eyes fixed on the ashes of the fire that had burned out. He hadn't slept, afraid of waking her. Ghost still lay at their feet, loyally guarding their rest through the long night. 3 days after the night in the library, Knox walked into Sterling's study with a thick file in his hand. His face was still cold as stone, but there was something in his eyes that showed what he had found was far from simple. Sterling was sitting behind his desk, but his mind wasn't entirely there. From the window, he could see the garden outside, where Rosie was chasing Ghost beneath the afternoon sun. The sound of her bright laughter reached all the way up there, and every time he heard it, he felt something inside his chest soften just a little. "I found it," Knox said, placing the file on the desk. "Everything you need to know about Garrett Cole." Sterling picked up the file and began to read. With every page he turned, his jaw tightened more, and his deep blue eyes darkened further. Knox stood there, delivering his report in an even voice. Garrett Cole was her father's business partner, Mr. Hartley, in a real estate deal 8 years ago. It was a fairly large project, a piece of land on the outskirts of the city with development potential. But during the process, Mr. Hartley discovered that Garrett was committing fraud, falsifying documents to steal most of the profits. "He was an honest man," Knox continued. "He decided to report Garrett to the police. He had arranged to meet with an investigating detective 2 days later. The fire happened the night before that meeting." Sterling stopped reading and looked up at Knox. "Garrett hired someone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement." "Yes," Knox nodded. "He hired a professional crew, paid them in cash, then covered his tracks by moving everything overseas. The local police investigated for 2 weeks. Then someone interfered, and the case was closed with the conclusion that it was an electrical fire. Garrett Cole wasn't just the killer. He also bought off the entire system to bury his crime." "Where was Winter at the time?" Sterling asked, his voice low. "She was in college in another city, more than 200 miles away. She survived because she wasn't home that night." Knox paused for a moment. Garrett thought getting rid of her parents was enough because they were the only ones who knew the evidence of his fraud. He didn't care about the daughter who was away. He thought he was clean. Sterling stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. Rosie was hugging Ghost, laughing as the dog licked her face. For one moment, he imagined Winter at 19, alone when she received the news that her parents had died in a fire, alone standing before the ashes of her childhood home, alone carrying that grief, without ever knowing it hadn't been an accident. "And now?" he asked, without turning back. "Who is Garrett Cole now?" "Chairman of Cole Development, One of the largest real estate companies in the region, Knox answered, and Preston Shaw's closest ally. Those two are tightly linked. Preston launders money through Garrett's real estate projects, and Garrett gets protection from Preston in the underworld. They need each other. Sterling turned back, his eyes sharp and cold. Then we can bring them both down at the same time. It's all in there. Knox pointed at the file, the evidence of money laundering that Miss Hartley found, together with what I uncovered about Garrett and the fire. It's enough for the FBI to open a major investigation. Neither Preston Shaw nor Garrett Cole will get away. Sterling nodded, picked up the phone, and called the lawyer. He spoke briefly, giving the order to prepare the file and send it to the FBI within 24 hours. When he hung up, Knox was still standing there, watching him with an unreadable expression. "Boss," Knox said after a moment of hesitation, "I have a question." Sterling looked at him and signaled for him to continue. "Why not handle this the old way?" Knox asked directly. "Faster. Cleaner. No FBI, no court, no waiting. You know we can do it." Sterling was silent for a long moment. He turned back toward the window, looking at Rosie as she held Mrs. Bellamy's hand and walked back into the house, Ghost trailing behind them. "Because she deserves to see justice," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Not violence. I want her to know that evil can be defeated the right way, that you don't have to become a monster in order to beat one." Knox looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're changing," he said. It wasn't a question. Sterling didn't answer right away. He looked at Rosie's scribbled drawing that he had framed and hung on the wall, the drawing of 4 figures holding hands that she had called family. "Maybe," he said at last. "Or maybe I'm becoming who I was supposed to be from the start." 24 hours later, the file was sent to the FBI. The official investigation began, but in the underworld, news traveled faster than light. Preston Shaw and Garrett Cole learned that someone was coming after them, and they weren't the kind of men who would sit still and wait to be arrested. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Sterling's phone rang, tearing through the stillness of the night at the Vance estate. He picked up immediately, the instinct of a man who had lived too long in the underworld keeping him alert even in sleep. Knox's voice came through on the other end, low and urgent. "The obsidian is on fire." Sterling sat upright at once, the blood in his veins turning to ice for one sharp moment before beginning to boil. The Obsidian, the most exclusive nightclub in Crescent Bay, the heart of the legal business empire he had spent years building, the place that represented his transformation from darkness into light, and now it was burning. He crossed to the window and looked toward the city. From the top of the hill, he could see the orange-red glow flickering in the distance, black smoke rolling into the night sky. His fist tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Any casualties?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. "None," Knox answered. "The club closed at midnight. The staff had all gone home. Only the building was damaged." A little luck in the middle of chaos, but Sterling knew it wasn't luck. Preston Shaw didn't want bloodshed. He wanted to send a message. "I can reach what you've built. I can burn everything you have. You aren't safe. The security cameras caught footage." Knox continued. "2 arsonists, masked, but we can trace them. This is clear criminal evidence." Sterling didn't answer. He stood there, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, his deep blue eyes darkening like the bottom of the sea before a storm. Rage surged through his veins, urging him to act, urging him to go find Preston that instant and end everything the way he would have in the past, quickly, ruthlessly, a Conchattana. Ghost stood beside his master, his golden eyes alert as if he could sense the storm raging inside him. The dog let out a low growl, not a threat, but more like a warning. "Sterling." A gentle voice came from the doorway. He turned and saw Winter standing there in a simple nightgown, her brown hair a little disheveled, her gray eyes full of worry. She hadn't been able to sleep after hearing the phone ring, and she had come looking for him. Winter saw Sterling, saw the fury tearing him apart from the inside, saw the man she had begun to love standing on the edge of destroying himself. She walked over to him and placed her small hand on his arm, feeling the muscles pulled tight as wire beneath the fabric of his shirt. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Preston," Sterling said through clenched teeth. "He burned the obsidian. He wants me to know he can touch everything I've built." Winter was silent for a moment, looking out the window where the flames still flickered in the distance. Then she turned back to him, her gray eyes calm and clear. "This is a trap," she said firmly. "He wants you angry. He wants you to strike first. If you go after him now, you'll walk straight into what he wants. Don't give him that." Sterling looked at her, his jaw still tight, the anger still blazing in those deep blue eyes. "He burned what I built," he said, his voice rough with rage. 10 years, Winter. 10 years I built that place from nothing, and he burned it down in one night. "You can build it again," Winter said, her hand still on his arm, warm and steady. "A building is only brick and glass, but if you choose violence, you'll lose more than that. You'll lose your chance to drag him into the light. You'll lose everything you've worked for these past months." She paused and looked straight into his eyes. "You'll lose yourself too." Sterling looked at her. She had just called him you so naturally, no longer the distant formal address she had used before, and somehow, that small thing cut through his anger and touched the part of him he had hidden for so many years. He drew in one deep breath, then another, trying to control the storm inside him. Ghost moved to stand beside Winter, as if the dog too were helping her keep him calm. Sterling picked up the phone and called the lawyer back. "Push the process faster," Deetha his voice, still cold but more controlled now. "I want the FBI to arrest Preston within 48 hours. Add arson to the file. We have evidence from the security cameras. Knox," he turned to his right-hand man, "increase security around the estate. I don't want anyone coming in here without permission." Knox nodded and left. In the east wing, Rosie was still sleeping peacefully, knowing nothing of what was happening outside. Mrs. Bellamy sat in a chair nearby, guarding the little girl's sleep like an old but faithful guardian angel. "I'll stay here," Winter said, her voice gentle but certain. "I'm not going anywhere." Sterling looked at her, and Winter saw something shift in his eyes. The anger was still there, but something else was rising beside it. Something softer, something more fragile. "For the first time in my life," he said, his voice gentler now, "I have something to lose, and that frightens me more than any enemy ever has." Winter didn't say anything. She only stepped closer, took his hand, and threaded her fingers through his. They stood together in the night, looking out at the distant city where the fire still burned, where the ruins of the obsidian still smoldered. No one said anything more. There was only the steady sound of Ghost breathing beside them, only the warmth of the other person's hand passing between them. They stood there holding on to each other, waiting for dawn and the final battle. The following afternoon, when the sun had begun to tilt toward the west, and golden light poured through the glass windows of the Vance estate, Preston Shaw appeared. He came with 4 of his men, the last loyal ones he had left, walking through the iron gates as though he were still the terrifying boss the whole city feared. But Sterling knew the truth. Preston had nothing left to lose. The FBI was on the way, the warrant had already been signed, and he knew it. This wasn't the visit of a powerful man. It was the final desperate move of a beast, cornered with nowhere left to run. Sterling stood in the main hall with Knox at his side when Preston walked in. The 2 men looked at each other, the bosses of 2 rival powers facing each other for the last time. Rosie wasn't here. Mrs. Bellamy had taken the little girl to the park early that morning on Sterling's orders. He didn't want her to witness anything that might happen today. But Winter was here. She stood beside Sterling, her back straight, her chin lifted high. Even though Knox had advised her to leave, she refused. This was her fight. The man standing in front of her was connected to the deaths of her parents. She wouldn't run. She would face him. Ghost stood in front of Winter, his silver-gray fur bristling, his golden eyes fixed on Preston with a savagery Winter had never seen in the gentle dog before. A low growl rolled continuously from deep in his throat, threatening and dark. For the first time, the dog showed just how dangerous he could be when protecting the people he loved. Preston looked at the scene before him and laughed, a sound sharp as a razor. "Look at this. Boss Vance has a new bodyguard, a widow, and a dog. How far you've fallen, Sterling." Sterling showed no irritation. His face was ice cold, his deep blue eyes utterly still. "Why are you here, Preston?" "To negotiate," Preston answered, the smile still on his lips but never reaching his eyes. "I know you sent the file to the FBI. I also know they're on their way here. So I have an offer. Call everything off, and I'll leave the city. Disappear. You'll never see me again. It's that simple." Sterling was about to answer, but Winter was faster. She stepped forward, even though Ghost tried to stop her. The dog growled anxiously but couldn't block her. He only moved with her, still keeping himself between her and Preston like a living shield. "You and your ally took my parents from me," Winter said, her voice cold as steel. "And you think I'm going to let you walk away?" Preston froze. The smile vanished from his mouth, replaced first by surprise and then by the flash of fear he didn't hide quickly enough. "So you know now," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Garrett said you'd never find out. 8 years, and no one found out." Winter looked straight into his eyes without blinking, without trembling. Her gray eyes burned with the fury she had held inside for so many years. But she didn't let it control her. She was cold. She was composed. "You just confessed," she said simply. Preston realized his mistake, but it was already too late. And right then, the sound of police sirens rose from outside, closer and closer, louder and louder. More than one car. The FBI had arrived. Preston went pale. He turned as if to run, but Knox and Sterling's men had already blocked every exit. Preston's men stood there helplessly, not daring to move now that they understood they were surrounded. The front doors flew open, and FBI agents poured in with guns raised and bulletproof vests on. They quickly subdued Preston and his men, cuffing each of them with cold, professional precision. "Preston Shaw, you are under arrest for money laundering, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder." The lead agent read the warrant aloud. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Another agent stepped over to Sterling and gave him a brief nod. Garrett Cole was arrested at his home at the same time. Neither of them has any way out now. Preston was being led toward the door, but he stopped and turned back to look at Winter one last time. His eyes were full of hatred, the stare of a man who had lost everything and blamed someone else for it. "You'll regret this," he snarled. Winter looked at him calmly, without shaking. "I've regretted it for 8 years already," she said, her voice even. "I regretted not knowing the truth. I regretted letting men like you walk free while my parents lay in the cold ground. Now it's your turn to regret." Preston was shoved outside, and the door closed behind him. The sound of police sirens faded into the distance, carrying away the man who had ruined Winter's life for the last 8 years. The hall fell into silence. Sterling turned to Winter and looked at her with deep blue eyes, softer now than ever before. He took her hand, their fingers threading together as though they had been made to fit that way. "It's over," he said softly. Winter looked at him, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, not tears of fear. These were tears of relief, of a burden 8 years old finally being laid down. "It's over," she repeated, her voice breaking. Ghost moved to stand beside them, his long tail wagging as though he understood that the danger had passed. The dog rested his head against Winter's leg, his golden eyes lifting to her with endless loyalty. The battle was over, and they had won. Not through violence, not through bloody revenge, but the right way, through justice. 1 week later, when everything had settled and Crescent Bay was slowly returning to its normal rhythm, Winter drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. This was where her parents rested, on a small hill overlooking the sea, where the wind carried the scent of salt and the distant sound of waves like an endless, gentle lullaby. She brought a bouquet of white daisies, the kind of flowers her mother had loved most. She remembered her mother once saying that white daisies symbolized sincerity and pure love, and her mother had always planted them in the little garden behind the house. That garden had burned along with the house 8 years earlier, but the memory of those pure white blossoms remained untouched in Winter's mind. Sterling came with her, but he stopped at a distance, standing beneath the shade of an old oak tree, giving her space to be alone with her parents. Ghost lay quietly beside him, his golden eyes following Winter without moving, as though he understood that this was a moment she needed to face by herself. Winter knelt before the 2 graves lying side by side and placed the bouquet of white daisies on the green grass covering the earth. She looked at the 2 names carved into the stone, the names she had carried in her heart for 8 long years. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice soft as the wind. "I didn't know the truth for 8 years. I thought it was an accident. I thought Mom and Dad were simply unlucky. I lived with that belief, tried to keep going without knowing that someone was responsible." She paused, drawing in a deep breath, feeling the sea wind brush against her cheeks. "But now I know, and I found justice for you. The men who did this will pay. They're in prison waiting for trial, and they'll never be free again. You can rest now." Tears slipped down her face, but they weren't tears of grief like before. They were tears of release, of the final burden at last being set down. "I'm all right now," she continued, her voice warmer. "I have someone beside me. Someone who loves me and Rosie. You would have liked him. He's hard on the outside but kind on the inside, just like Dad. And he takes care of my daughter as though she were his own. You don't have to worry about me anymore." Winter rose to her feet and wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. She looked at the two graves one last time, and a small smile touched her lips. "I'm going to live happily," she said. "I promise. For me, and for you too." She turned and saw Sterling still standing there beneath the oak tree, waiting for her. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting streaks of golden light across him. Ghost got to his feet the moment he saw her walking back and wagged his tail in welcome. Winter came to Sterling's side and took his hand. His hand was warm and steady as always. "Thank you," she said, looking into his deep blue eyes. "For everything. For being there for me. For helping me find the truth. For giving Rosie and me a home." Sterling gave a slight shake of his head. "You don't owe me thanks." "I know," Winter said with a smile. "But I want to say it." They stood there in silence, looking out over the deep blue sea stretching all the way to the horizon. The sea breeze moved gently around them, carrying the scent of salt and the faint fragrance of daisies from the bouquets resting on the graves. The sky was clear without a single cloud, as though even nature were celebrating for them. "I've closed the past," Winter said after a while, her voice quiet and peaceful. "Now I want to write a new future." Sterling looked at her, his blue eyes gentle in the way only she ever got to see. "With whom?" Winter laughed softly, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes, making her whole face glow. "Do you really have to ask?" Sterling smiled, a real smile, the first true one Winter had ever seen on his always guarded face, and it made him look younger, softer, more human. He pulled her into his arms and held her close there in the sea, wind, and sunlight, among the scent of flowers and the sound of waves. Ghost wagged his tail beside them, his golden eyes full of satisfaction, as though he understood that his family had just become whole. The past had been closed, and the future was opening before them, bright and full of promise. 6 months later, spring returned to Crescent Bay with warm breezes carrying the scent of flowers and the cheerful songs of birds throughout the gardens of the Vance estate. Blossoms were everywhere, deep red roses lining the paths, pure white daisies blooming beside the fence, and the whole garden seemed to glow after a long winter. That afternoon, as the sunset began to wash the sky in shades of gold and amber, Sterling took Winter's hand and led her out to the stables. She didn't know what he intended, only followed him with curiosity and trust. When they arrived, Winter saw Midnight standing there, his black mane braided with shining white ribbons. Ghost sat beside him, his tail wagging as though he were waiting for something important. Sterling turned to look at her, his deep blue eyes gentle beneath the fading sunset. He didn't kneel the way men did in fairy tales. There wasn't a large diamond ring in a red velvet box. There wasn't a long speech prepared in advance. He only looked at her and asked, his voice low and warm, "Do you want to stay? Not because of a contract, not because of debt, only because you want to." Winter looked at him, the man who had changed her life, the man who had given her and Rosie a home, the man who had taught her to believe in love again after so much pain. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, caught hold of his collar, and kissed him. Their first kiss, beneath the golden amber sunset, as it slowly faded away, beside the black horse that had witnessed everything from the beginning, from the fateful auction to this very moment. The wedding took place 1 month later, right there at the Vance estate, small and intimate, just like their love. Only Knox, Mrs. Bellamy, and a few of their closest people were there. There weren't hundreds of strangers invited, no press and cameras, no display or extravagance. There were only the people they loved. Winter wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of white daisies, the kind of flowers her mother had loved most. She imagined her mother watching from somewhere, smiling. Sterling wore a black suit as always, but today his eyes were no longer cold. They shone with the color of happiness, of peace, of a man who had finally found the meaning of his life. Rosie was the little flower girl, wearing a pale pink dress that spread around her like a tiny princess gown, holding a pretty flower basket in her hands. She smiled through the entire ceremony, swinging her basket and waving at everyone. Ghost carried the rings on a white bow tied around his neck, walking up beside Sterling with the solemn dignity of a loyal guard. The ceremony was simple, The vows were brief, but every word was sincere. Every word carried the weight of the long journey they had traveled together. After the wedding, while everyone was congratulating the bride and groom, Rosie ran over and threw her arms around Sterling's leg. She looked up, her wide eyes sparkling with joy. "Papa, put me on your shoulders." The whole room fell silent. It was the first time Rosie had called Sterling Papa. Not Mr. Sterling the way she had before, not a stranger, but Papa. Sterling froze, the man who had made an entire city tremble, the boss of the Vance Empire, suddenly standing there with tears filling his eyes. He bent down, lifted Rosie into his arms, and held her tightly, as though she were the most precious treasure in the world. "Papa is here, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Papa will always be here." Winter stood beside them, tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. Her family, her real family, was finally whole. Many years later, the Vance Empire became completely legitimate. Sterling left the underworld behind and focused on real estate and charitable work. He built orphanages across the city, quietly helping children who had once been just like him. Rosie grew into an intelligent and compassionate young woman. The little girl she had once been became a human rights lawyer, protecting the vulnerable the way her mother had once needed protection. She said she wanted to make sure no one would ever suffer injustice the way her grandparents had. Sterling and Winter had a son as well, and they named him Harrison, after the foster father who had given Sterling everything. The boy inherited his father's deep blue eyes and his mother's warm smile. Ghost grew old and passed away after 15 loyal years beside the family. The dog was buried in the estate garden, where he had once played with Rosie when she was little. The family later raised a new puppy, Ghost's own son. Rosie named him Spirit, because she said Ghost's soul would live on in his child. Midnight also lived to old age, cared for as a member of the family until his final day. The black horse died peacefully in the familiar stable, where he had witnessed Sterling and Winter's first kiss and Sterling's proposal. And sometimes, on evenings lit by sunset, people still saw them there. The retired boss and the woman who had changed him, standing side by side in the stables, hand in hand, looking out toward the sea. Their story began with an auction and $500,000, but it ended with something money could never buy: family. Thank you all for listening to this story until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us. Don't forget to share this video with friends who believe that love can change even the coldest hearts. And please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the moving stories we share each day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Please leave a comment below and share what is in your heart. Your words are the greatest encouragement for us to keep bringing you even better stories. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.